Well, the phone rings. You look at the caller ID and you do not know the number. And for some strange, unknown reason, you decide to pick it up anyways. And it is some worthy organization wanting your money, and normally you would turn these requests down without a thought. But for this time, you are sympathetic to their cause. You have a little bit of extra money in the checking account, and so you agree to donate $20. However, you don't like giving your credit card over the phone, so what you do is you ask them to send you a pledge card in the mail, and then you will send in a check. Well, it's a few weeks later. The car has broken down. There's some unexpected medical bills come in the mail, and you see this pledge card sitting there. And you think, did I really agree to donate to this? You know, there are times where it seems really difficult to follow through on your word and on your pledge. Well, it was just a few weeks ago that we voted in a new budget here at Good Shepherd, and that budget is a commitment that we have made, which is actually going to take effect next week. We are at the end of our fiscal year, and we will be starting our new year in July. And so I thought it might be appropriate on this occasion to look at Paul's letter to Corinth today, because it is in that letter that they seem to be having some difficulty in a follow-through on their financial commitment. And so maybe there's something we can learn to prepare ourselves for the upcoming year. It was a year earlier, looking at the reading today, that that they had committed to Paul that they would take up a collection for the church in Jerusalem because the church was struggling financially. And Paul was writing to this congregation then, urging them to excel in everything. He said, you a year ago started, so now finish doing it as well. And so Paul encourages this congregation to follow through on its pledge. And it is interesting to watch and to see how Paul motivates them to give. And it may be helpful in our case. So let's take a look. I do suspect that when the Christians of Corinth gathered for worship, there was no 6-foot-tall thermometer indicating that they had already achieved 45% of their goal for the relief of the church in Jerusalem. And I also suspect they did not have posters, heart-wrenching posters that tugged at your heart, pictures of widows and orphans. And the terms that we take for granted today, like budget goal, probably would have caused Paul a little bit of offense. You know, as we look at this reading, we also have to realize that Paul was working under some very difficult circumstances because he was still trying to rebuild his confidence, the confidence of the Corinthians in him. Because you see, Paul was competing with what he called some super apostles. These were some other people who came through and were teaching them another gospel, which really was no gospel at all, and they were pointing fingers at Paul and raising questions about his credibility. And so Paul in his letters is trying to regain his credibility with the Corinthians, and it seems like he's made some progress as we look in this letter, but he was still working to earn their full trust. And it is not easy asking money from a congregation whose trust in Paul had wavered. Think about that. Have you ever had to make an appeal to a group knowing that there were people in that group who were suspicious of your leadership? It would not be an easy thing to do. But it didn't stop Paul. He felt very strongly about helping the Jerusalem church out, and so he did make his appeal. So let's look at his methodology a little bit. What did Paul do? How did he motivate them to give a year after they had made their pledge? Well, the first thing that he did is he asked them to follow by example. And by example, what he did is he pointed to the Macedonians and said, look how they did it. We can do it too. I'll go back and reread that again. He says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. So, look at the Macedonian church. For in a severe test of affliction, they were in affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Look at the collection that they collected. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. Some of you might say, and they were just looking at creating a little bit of competition, that old competitive spirit. Look, they can do it. You guys can do it too. But I'd rather put a more positive spin on it. I think Paul was just giving them an example to look at. This is what honest, heartfelt giving looks like. And so he used that as a motivation tool to number one, follow by example. But he also used encouragement as a tool because he encourages them by reminding them of their own qualities of accomplishment and praising them. We read that in verse 7. It says, but as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you. And then he goes on and asks them to follow through on their pledges. And because you see, the Corinthians, they were a bright and a very talented bunch, very passionate and committed to excelling in all matters. And so Paul encourages them by bringing this point out of their desire to be excellent at everything that they do. And so he just took that a step further and say, let's do that also in your giving and your support of the Jerusalem church. So he used example, he used encouragement. There's a third way that he could have motivated, and many churches will motivate this way today, and that is through the use of fear or the use of the law. Paul could have used that, but he did not. Paul oftentimes speaks about not living under the burden of the law, but rather within the freedom of the gospel. And so Paul was very clear about that. In verse 8, he says, I say this not as a command, not as a law that you have to do this, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. And so he says your giving then really should come out of gratitude. And gratitude cannot be compelled. And Paul assures them that his counsel is not a command, but rather an appeal to show how genuine their love is. And so right there is that word, that motivator that should be motivating us in our giving, and that word is love. He desires that giving is a natural occurrence, motivated out of love. Love for what Jesus has done for us. And what exactly has Jesus done for us? Well, we speak of that gospel message week in and week out, and there are different metaphors, different ways that we can explain it. And did you notice the way that Paul explained it to them? He's talking about issues of money, and so he uses monetary discussion to show about what Jesus has done for us. Let us look at that, verse 9. He says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. He's obviously interplaying here the concept of money, but also richness and blessings in the spiritual sense also work in with this. So Paul has showed them how that they benefited from the actions of Christ, that they became rich through Christ's self-emptying poverty. We are talking about an economy here, and in this economy, the currency in it is love. And one who was rich beyond compare emptied himself and became poor as each and every one of us, so that we, through him, might become rich. Rich in love. You know, we give of ourselves because